Hey guys, back with another video. Today we'll just address a couple things many of you have been asking. Uh, they are pretty much starting the calendar off at a particular date, giving today's date a different color, loading dates from a server, creating header views, adding animation, and just creating a simple date boundary. So let's just step right in. So what I have so far is a typical setup. I have a date formatter, which I've set up. I have my outlets for month, year, and calendar views. I also have my view to load. I don't really have anything in there, but I do set up the initial visible dates so that the month and the year view can be properly populated. April in 2017. All right. I also have the functions that handle the bulk of the configuration of the cells. Right. We have the configure cell function, and what it does is pretty much just that. It calls all of the other functions that help configure the cell, namely the text color, visibility, and cell selection. We now go to the configure calendar function. We start at February 2017 and end at today's date. We also set up a cell in cell for item at, where we call configure cell, which calls the functions that we described before. We also have the setup calendar function being called in the did scroll, so that whenever we scroll, it updates. So with this, we have selection with the text being red. When you deselect, it becomes white, and whenever you scroll, the month and year changes. So let's start off with starting the calendar off at a particular date. This can easily be accomplished if you use the calendar's scroll to date function, and we will pass to it a date instance. So whenever you run, it will simply scroll to date. You just saw that the scroll to date have an animation, and many of you might not want that. So we can set the animate scrolls option to false. By default, it's true. So let's run it and see what it looks like. And there we have it, no scrolling. Now there's no point scrolling to the month without actually selecting the date, right? So let's do that. We're gonna select a date, which would be, again, today's date. With the date now set up, when we run the calendar, it should scroll to today's date and also select it immediately. Let's say you wanted to configure today's date text color to be different to the others. You can simply handle this in the handle cell text color function. So let's say we wanted to change it to blue if it's today's date, right? We compare the today's date with the date passed in from cell state, and if it is today's date, we're going to set the color to blue, else we're going to set the color to what it was before. Today's date is simply a date instance of today. Now this is an important distinction from what's going on here versus what I do. Many people compare date objects with date objects. I do not like to do this because date contains other information like region, and it also contains hours, minutes, and seconds. Therefore, two dates might be the same, but they might just be off by one or more seconds, which would cause them to not be equal. Therefore, I like to convert dates to strings that does not have hours, minutes, and seconds attached to it. So for that, I'm going to use the date formatter. So by running the app, the selected text of today's date should be blue and the others should not be blue. Therefore, let's put a breakpoint to see what I've done wrong. We can see here that the date formatter's format was changed earlier on and higher up in my code. So I'm just going to forcefully change it here back to what it should be, year, month, and date. So with this, everything should now work. Today's date should be blue and the others should be behaving normally, white and red. One last thing about that handle cell text color function. Since it is called many times, let's not create the dates every single time in here. Let's just create it as a variable of the view controller, so it's only created once. Next on the list, I believe we have loading dates from a server. In order to load dates from a server, we need to configure our event.views, those red views you see right here. So we're going to go to our cell and add the outlet. Then we're going to connect that outlet to storyboard by selecting it and connecting it. With our .view connected, we can now expand our configure cell function to handle events, which we'll do now. Handle cell events. So we will leave this here for a while and go to an extension of our view controller where we will create a function to get our events from the server. Okay, I do not have a real server, so I'm gonna fake one. This fake server will return dates and string events in the form of a dictionary. So let's just return some quick fake values from our fake server. I'll just ensure that the formatter is of the right date format to create the dates so that we don't have that problem before. With the function created, we now need some sort of array or dictionary to store the events from the server, right? So I'll create one right now. But instead of creating it to be date string, I'll create it to be string string. And I'll tell you why that is right now. As I have mentioned before, I do not like to compare date objects directly because when I'm comparing dates to see, if this date corresponds with this event, I'm not too much bothered about hours, minutes, and seconds that is attached to a date. I'm just interested in the actual date, be it January 1st, 2017. Therefore, I prefer converting my date objects into date strings. And those strings will be of the format year, month, and date. Hours, minutes, and seconds will be removed. There is one other thing to note here. The data from my server, I prefer storing them in dictionaries rather than arrays, if I can help it. With an array, let's say we have, say, 50 events from a server. Whenever we get to our cell for item at index path function, where we configure every cell on screen, we would have to loop through all of those items in the array for every cell. It's much more efficient if we store our data in a dictionary where we can pull out the events by using the date as a key. This makes your library, your calendar library, scroll a lot smoother. So I prefer dictionaries to arrays whenever I can help it. So on a typical app, when your view loads, you would fetch the data from the server, right? Well, since I don't have a real server, I'm going to fake that using the global dispatch queue. It's going to dispatch after 2 seconds after view dot load, pretending that the server took 2 seconds to load. Let's get the date from the server. It's get server events. That's self.get server events. So now we have our get server events function, and our object is of type date string, right? We need to convert that into string string. So for this, I will use my formatter again. So I will now use a loop in order to convert all those date objects into strings, and then I will take those strings and save it in my events from the server as a key, and as a value I'll leave it as the event. So basically I've just converted date string into string string. And with this completed, our events from the server dictionary data source is now populated. So now we need to reload the calendar, right? Well, since we are on a dispatch queue, we need to reload the calendar back on the main queue as good iOS developers. So now that we have the loading of the dates and the events from the server complete, we need to head back to the handle events function to set up the cell, right? Remember, we left that incomplete. So we just need to change the cells, dot views visibility based on whether or not there is an event that is attached to it. Okay, so cell.event.view is hidden, and we're gonna just set the condition whether or not the events from server contains it or not. So now let us build our project and see how it looks. Well, we're not seeing any of the dot views because remember we had our calendar scroll to today's date, right? But if you look on February and March, you can see the events. So tell you what, so you can see it clearly, let me comment out the scroll into date and selection code, and let's run the calendar. You will then see the events appear 2 seconds later, right there, right after we get the events from server. So what's next? Let's create header views. So right now, let's go create a header view that is built and managed by the calendar. It would scroll whenever the user scrolls. We start by creating a new file. We'll call this calendar header view, and it will be a JTAppleCalendar reusable view subclass. Alright, we don't want anything in there. We'll just leave it empty for now. Now let's go to the main storyboard and let's register for a header view. We will now set it up with 7 labels for the month, and we will just copy these labels over. We will put these labels inside of a stack view, and we will make the labels center alignment. Then we will set the stack view's borders to be 0, and we'll set the stack view fill to be filled equally. Then we're going to change the days. Let's now register our header view. We'll simply call it header, and we would set the class to be a subclass of calendar header. Let's make sure we fix that import there. So we're going to set the class to be calendar header, and let's finally head back to the code. Now, in order to implement headers, we simply need 2 delegate functions, one called header view for date range and the other called calendar month size. Let's set up the month size first. We're just going to set the month size to be 50. That's how big we want the header to be. And next, we're going to instantiate a new header view. We're just going to dequeue a reusable supplementary view. Let's just do that right now. For the identifier, we use the same one that we registered with on Interface Builder, which was header, and then we just passed the index path. We create it to be the same class, which is our calendar header class, and we finally return it. Now let's build and run and see what this looks like. And there we have it. We have the headers which scroll when you scroll with the calendar. So with the header views complete, all that's left to be done is to add a simple animation. Now, I'm by no means an animation expert, so what I've done is I've just gotten some animation code from online, which I will just add it to a UI view extension. And I will just paste that code in here. The animation is called bounce animation. So we want that whenever a user taps on a cell, we can just do a simple bounce animation. So we can just add that one line of code here, cell.bounce. And let's see how it looks. Now we see here that we can still scroll, and whenever I tap on a cell, there is a subtle bounce animation. So with that, we have now reached the final item on our list, which is creating a date boundary. So we know that the start date generates dates from the start of the month, and the end date always generates till the end of the month, regardless of what date you put in there. Creating a date boundary is particularly useful to developers who have single, double, and 3-row calendars. Sometimes they want the user's scroll to literally stop sometimes in the middle of a month and not necessarily at the end of the month. So we can create a date boundary pretty simple. Let's go to the code and enter the did in decelerating function. And what we're going to do is set up a date boundary like this. We create a date that we do not want to cross, right? In this case, let's select April 2nd. We don't want to cross April 2nd. If they cross April 2nd, we want them to scroll back to March. Okay? So April 2nd. So let's put that in here. And then we put the date that we want them to scroll back to, right? If they pass April 2nd, we want them to scroll back to, say, March 5th. Okay? I specifically chose that column because it lines up to the start. So let's build the app and see what that looks like. Okay, and as we scroll past April, we realize that as soon as we release, it scrolls right back to March. We have successfully created a date boundary. So I hope that these tips and tricks will help you develop a better calendar library. If you like the project, don't forget to leave a star rating on GitHub. More information is provided in the description section of this video. Have a good one, guys.